Right, hello. So here we're just going to take a quick look at network rendering using the render farm here at Brunel. So this project, just an example project, this one happens to be set up to render in Arnold. So the first thing you do is you do everything you'd normally do with kind of any render setup. You'd kind of make your projects, you'd kind of create your lights, get your everything, get your animation sorted, so that basically you're ready to render on the local machine. You'd probably do a quick, test render or something like that of your scene on the local machine. Just takes a few minutes. So here's just a kind of example. So that was the test render on the local machine. So it's kind of looking okay here. That's kind of what I would expect to see. So this animation, really simple. All I've done is just created a turntable of this model here. So if I play it through Maya's timeline, I just get a little bit of animation, 24 frames, something like that. You can see down here on the timeline. So pretty simple setup, but whatever scene you've got, that's what you're going to render. I happen to be using a Mac here, so there are a couple of little differences in the way this works between the PC and the Mac, so I'll try and point those out as we go along. Right? Okay, so everything here is just on the local machine for now. So probably what I would do is I just check my render settings. So at the moment I've got a project, it's on my desktop on my local Mac. At the moment it's set to render there, but I just check all my render settings are sensible. So this is an Arnold scene, so I want to make sure my Arnold render engine is kind of selected. Our render farm will work with Arnold or V-Ray, or of course Maya software or hardware or whatever you might want to use there, but mainly Arnold or V-Ray is probably what you're going to be using. I've set this up to render as EXRs. It will render with all the standard formats, but this just happens to be an XR. Obviously, if you're rendering an animation, pretty important that you're rendering to some kind of still image format. If your renderer lets you render to a QuickTime movie, don't do that. You want to render a sequence of still images out of this, because the way the render farm works, it's going to split and give each machine in the render farm a frame at a time to render, and then they're all going to bash out those frames and save them in a directory, so you don't want it kind of rendering to some kind of QuickTime movie for sure. Okay, so some kind of still image format. Obviously I want to make sure animation's turned on so that I don't just render one frame, so I want to make sure it's not on name single frame here, because then I'm just going to get a single frame out of the render anyway, just like it would be on the local machine. So I've set mine up to name.hash.extension, that's fine. And I've checked my frame numbers match the frame range that I actually want to render. So all this is standard stuff. This would be just the way you'd set up your project to render on the local machine. Got my kind of width and height resolution all set up. So basically set everything up just the same way you would to render on the local machine. Okay, and then make sure obviously you've saved your project. Right? Okay, so then on the Mac, there's kind of one step you have to do on the Mac that's different from the PC. So I'm just going to point that out here. And what you have to do on the Mac is connect to the render farm repository area. So this is kind of a collection of disks somewhere on the Brunel network, and we have to put all of our things to be rendered on there. On the PCs, you're already connected to this automatically, so you don't actually need to connect manually to it. On the Mac, you have to connect manually. So in the Finder here, I just go to Go, Connect to Server, and then I have to connect to this server here. Now that's a kind of bit of a mouthful to kind of say there. Basically, you don't actually have to put that SMB : / in at the beginning, but this bit here, this uv-ren-dn1.ikb.brunel.ac.uk, you do have to. That's the machine address, and then there's a /, and then there's render farm repository here at the end. That's the name of the folder on kind of this machine that we want to access. So that's basically it. I'm just going to pop this up here on the screen for a minute. So if you need to access this folder on the PC or the Mac, it's the same thing, but the Windows PCs and the Macs have a very slightly different way of referring to locations. The biggest difference, as you can see, is basically Windows PCs use backslashes to denote the beginning and for between the machine and the name of the folder on the machine. Macs use / instead. It's the great thing about standards, everyone can have their own one, so we just need to bear that in mind. Whether or not this is case sensitive, you can see probably not too case sensitive, because both those seems to work on the different platforms. but hey ho, you know, I probably would stick to more or less those cases, especially for the folder on the actual machine. That's probably case sensitive, but hey ho, you could try it all lowercase and see if it worked. But those addresses are pretty important. Okay, so I've typed in that address basically up there before, so it's already appearing there for me. So I'm just going to connect to that area. Okay, now you may find that you don't need to type your username and password in here. Because I've logged in as a kind of unusual user, I'm actually having to type in my Brunel network name and password. So you may skip that step, this just may appear straight away. One thing that's worth bearing in mind, to network render, your account has to have been set up with the IT team to enable network rendering. If that hasn't been the case, then you're going to find out that you won't be able to access this render farm repository. So just bear that in mind. If you type in your username and password and you get absolutely no luck, then that's probably the case, and you might need to talk to one of the IT team just to get your account set up to enable network rendering. Okay, mine has been, so not surprisingly I can access this area. So this is the contents of the render farm repository, and each of us, users at Brunel that have been set up for this, have our own folder inside this jobs area. Now you need to make sure anything you want to network render is in your folder inside there, because the machines on the render farm can see the contents of this folder, but they can't see anything on your local drive. So there's no point having files on the C drive, not copying them to here, and expect them to network render. They won't. So you need to copy everything to here somewhere. So there's a bunch of kind of randomly named folders up the top here from previous renders, but you should find you have one of your account folders somewhere in this jobs folder. Yeah, so that's on the render farm repository, just in jobs. Yeah, you'd see the same thing on the PC. So I'm going to go and find my folder here. So there is mine, there we go, and I'm just going to open that. And I probably have a bunch of stuff in here already. I'm not going to worry about that too much, but here is my project that I had on the desktop of the Mac. There's very little there. There's basically a Maya file in the scenes folder, maybe a couple of versions, and then in source images I actually have this project lit by an HDR image, so it's got a light dome and it's using an HDR image. So you don't have to have that, just this project happens to have. So I want to make sure I copy all of that to here, so I'm just going to copy that. It's called RC Car, and here it goes. It's usually fairly quick, so there we are. Great, so it's in there. So that's step one. At this stage I'd probably also just launch the Deadline monitor. So up here I'm just going to search the Mac, and I'm going to type in Deadline. As you see, it automatically finds it. You could do the same on the PC, obviously. So Deadline monitor, here we go. So here it is, it's just starting up. So this is, I just need to drag it onto the window here so you can see it. So this is actually the monitor application for the render farm. Yep. So up here we can see kind of recently rendered things. So you can see everyone's projects. So you can see here's the user ID in the middle. So I rendered one recently there, but then there's another couple of ones from other users. You can manage your own render jobs. You can't anyone else's, but you can at least see what's going on. So if yours hasn't started rendering yet, you can see where you are in the queue. Okay, we'll come back to that later on, but just make sure this starts. If it doesn't start, then you know you have a problem. Up the top of the window here, you can also see this is the path to get to this area. Now I've connected to this on the Mac. On the Mac I can access this render farm repository by going into the volumes folder and render farm repository. On the PC you would probably still see the full UV, ren, dn1, etc. render farm repository. Yep. On the PC or the Mac you might even want to create a shortcut to that so you can get back to it a bit more easily, but hey, there's the text for you there. Right, so we're now ready to render. We've copied our files to the render farm repository, we've checked the monitor as launched OK. I'm just going to move the monitor out of the way a bit. Right, so I'm going to go back to Maya, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my project to that project on the render farm repository. So on the Mac here, I need to go find out where that render farm repository was. So on the Mac, I know that I've just looked at the monitor, and I can know that I can type in volumes render farm repository, and it should take me, I may even put a slash there at the end, to that folder. If I press return, it's probably going to disappear. Yeah, it's going to disappear there. But if I go back to set project again, it's now going to remember, okay, that's where you want to go to, and there's my render farm repository. So I'm actually going to go in there and find my folder again. So here we go, jobs, there we go. And then I'm going to find my actual EESRMC, so find the one with your user ID, open that, and then I'm going to go into my RC Car, the one I just copied, there it is, and I want to set my project to be there. Setting the project there is really important, because when I render, Maya's usually using my project to define the folder that my rendered images end up in, and I really want to make sure the rendered images end up on the render farm. If I leave it on a local drive, all the render machines will render to a machine that's on their own hard drive, and I'm not going to be able to see those images, so that's going to be useless. So setting the project, really important. Right, okay, so I'm then going to open the project. You can see up here in this menu bar, this is actually still the local copy of the project. So I'm going to open the one that's on the render farm repository. Now, because I've set my project, up here it's now saying volumes render farm repository. Again, on the PC there, you would probably see that full UV ren dn1 ikb Brunel AC. Yep. So on the PC, that's the folder you'd need to be going to, not volumes render farm repository. Volumes render farm repository is just on the Mac. On the PC, you want to go to this full location. Yep. Okay. Right. So there we go, but after the render farm repository bit, the jobs, your username, and then your project, that would still be the same whether it's the PC or the Mac. It's just the bit before, really, render farm repository that's different on the PC and the Mac. But I've set my project, so it's taking me straight to that folder anyway, so I can just open my project from the render farm. Okay, so it's not really looking any different because obviously it's the same thing, but up here in the top window I can see I'm actually looking at the copy that's on the render farm, which is obviously very important. So I would probably just want to check my settings are still fine. Particularly what I want to check here in the render settings is this path, because this is where it's going to put the rendered images. So it's saying volumes render farm repository, jobs, ESRC, RC Car, and then the images subfolder. That's great. Obviously on the PC I would want that to say //uv-ren, you know, etc. .ikb Brunel UK render farm repository, and then the rest of it. Yep. The crucial thing is it's going to save the outputted images there. Obviously this is pretty much my last chance to make sure everything's correct here, so it should all be the same because I saved this. I want to make sure obviously the camera that I'm rendering is correct, so that's all looking good. Now if you haven't set your project right, what you can find here is obviously any textures that you brought into Maya, they all need to be on your render farm repository as well. But if you hadn't set your project right, you might find that any external files haven't come in properly. So this might be a good time just to do a quick, you know, test render. Is it looking okay? So here I am. I'm just doing a quick test render. So this is kind of going in here. It's going to start. I'm not going to look at the whole lot because, you know, it'll take several minutes to render, but I might just start this, see if I get something that looks sensible for the first few seconds of this render. So here it is. There's Arnold kind of just setting itself up. Just a bit of a blank screen. So there we go. I can see that basically at least my light dome must be working. You know, there's, you know, this would be black essentially. I would be seeing nothing. So I'm kind of reasonably happy. Now the only gotcha with that is if I just select this light dome here in the background, of course because I'm on the machine that I originally had my files, there's a slight possibility that this file here is actually looking for the original light dome that's on my desktop here. And of course it can still see that because I'm still on this machine, but one of the render farm nodes wouldn't. Hopefully it's picking up a version of it that's on the render farm repository, but I might just want to go check. So I'm just going to look here. So here's my sky dome, there's my color, so this is mapped here, so I just click this, So here we are. So this is looking for this HDR image in the source images RC car, but where is it looking for that? Aha! Yep, here we can see we've got this problem. So this is actually looking for a version of this image that's in my desktop folder on a local machine. Now that's great on this machine, it's going to render okay, wouldn't on the render farm. So I'm just going to select this and tell it that it really needs to go to the version that's on the render farm. So I'm just going to go, because I've already done this and my project's on the render farm, I can just sort of select something here rather than go through the whole rigmarole of getting there. So I should just be able to go into here. So here I'm in the render farm repository, jobs, then obviously my account somewhere down here, EESR-SMC. Let's just type that in. There we go. And it's in my RC car source images, obviously, and there it is. There's the actual image. Yep. So I want to tell it that that's the actual light dome that you need to use. Yep. Obviously it doesn't look any different, but it's actually a different thing, and I can see now this is a different place that it's looking for this. Yep. So that's really important. Okay, and you might just want to double check that if you're using external files in your project, are they coming from the right place? Yep. Otherwise, when you render, you're going to find bits of your scene shot black, textures not appearing, lights not working if they're using HDR images, and things of that sort. Right. Okay, so that's fine. That's pretty much the only thing like that I had in this project, so I'm going to be pretty okay. Now, I'm all set up here. I'm just going to do an increment and save. I'm just a bit paranoid. That's probably not a bad thing to do. So then I need to actually submit the job to the render farm. Now I need to have up here a shelf called deadline. Now if you've never used the render farm before, you won't have one of those. I've used the render farm before, so I do have one, but there's nothing in it. So what you need to do, if either it's not functioning here or there's nothing appearing here, or you don't even have a shelf called deadline, is you actually have to load a script in and run it in order for this deadline submission thing to appear. So a couple of ways you can do that. You can either open the script editor down here from the bottom, that works fine, or you can go up to these windows here. I guess there's probably a general editors, and there's probably a script editor there. Exactly the same thing, just different ways of getting to it. Okay, so I'm just going to open this up a little bit. Now this looks pretty forbidding, but we basically don't need to worry too much about this. All I want to do is load in a script. So I want to load a script, and that is actually on the render farm repository. So you want to navigate there. So again, if you're on the PC, you want to navigate to this folder. On the Mac, you can just navigate to volumes render farm repository. So I've already gone there. So I want to go to the render farm repository. So I'm going to select one of these little beasties that's going to take me there. Now that's my desktop, and that's the render farm repository. Okay, but I actually just want to go to the render farm repository itself. So I'm going to go up one folder, up another one, and up another one. Yep. So that's where the jobs folder is located. So I don't need to do this every time. Once you've done this, you probably find you won't need to do this very often again. You might just need to do it occasionally. So inside this render farm repository, there is a submission folder. There we go. And you need to open that. Now inside here, there's a folder for every application that you can use with Deadline, our render farm management software. This came with the Deadline installation, so a lot of these we don't even use with render farm, but there is a folder for Maya. Yep. If you were trying to do network rendering with another application that we have, like Nuke or something like that, you would probably want to install those scripts instead, but I'm just doing this demonstration with Maya here, so I'm going to use Maya. So inside the Maya folder, there's a few subfolders. We need to open this client subfolder here, and inside here there's then a couple of files. One of them is basically 2 words, this user setup mel, it's hardly anything in it. We want this Deadline Maya client mel file slightly bigger. You can see that one's 34 bytes, that's 3 kilobytes. So I open that up, and it opens it up here down in the script editor. Now I just want to run the whole lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my mouse in here, sort of kind of click somewhere in this window, go to edit, select all, so the whole thing's selected, and then I'm just going to click this play button here just to tell Maya to run that script. So I'm just going to say run that, off it goes, you know, does a whole bunch of stuff, but it basically installs a deadline shelf and makes a deadline button. So now I should have a deadline shelf, and if I'm lucky I have a deadline button. No, I don't have a deadline button, or at least I don't have a deadline icon. Okay, right, okay, so my icon for some reason didn't get created, but it's still functioning correctly. Right? So you'll probably see a little green icon here most of the time. For some reason today it's decided not to appear. So basically the deadline shelf should be there, that script should have installed everything, and if I just select where this icon would normally be, this would be my submit to deadline. Right? So here we are, submit to deadline. Most things here I don't need to change. Up here, this is the name that you're actually going to see in the deadline monitor when you kind of see your render progressing. So this is the monitor, so it's the job name that's going to appear in this list. So you know, just set that to whatever you want. The default will be the project, so I'm happy with that. Most of the stuff here you don't really need to change. That's all about submitting to different pools or groups, so sub bits of machines. Don't need any of that. So I'm just going to scroll down here. This you just want to double check. It should all come from the original file. So there's my frame list, so frame 1 to 24, that's what I want. Frames per task, that's the number of frames that get sent to each machine in the render farm at a time. So at the moment each machine is given one frame. When it's finished that one frame, it's going to come back and ask for the next frame to render, but you might decide you want to give it 10 frames at a time or something like that. That's entirely up to you. Okay, so I'm going to leave that at 1. So additional frame options, here you definitely want to check this. So camera, this should come from the Maya project. I'm a little paranoid, so I often set the camera manually here. Nothing more frustrating than rendering something for a few days and finding it's rendered the wrong camera. So turntable camera 1 in my case. This project path should be set because I've set my project, and that's fine. It's on the render farm repository. Just check that that's on the render farm repository in particular, yeah, and then it's the right folder. If it's not, you can just click here and manually set the right folder. Output path, again, really important to make sure that is going onto the render farm repository. It's going into my subfolder, it's going to my project images. That's great, so I don't need to change that. But again, if it wasn't going to the right place, you can check it. Okay, I don't need to do any of this stuff here. Deadline job type, Maya render job, that's what I want. Down here, really nothing I want to set there. If I did have several cameras, you could submit each camera as a separate render job. Similarly, if you had render layers, you could submit them as a separate render job. There might be occasions where you'd want to do that. But basically, that's it. Yep, there's nothing more I want to change there. So I'm just going to submit this job to deadline and see how we go. So let's submit the job. It takes a few seconds, not very long, usually 10 or 15 seconds. There we go, hey ho. So it says, great, it's submitted this job, so deadline commander, submitted to repository, and using renderer Arnold, so it gives me a last minute check. Okay, is it going with the right render? Okay, so fine. So I'm basically submitted there, so I can just sort of close this window, I don't need it anymore. Then it's a good idea just to double check with the deadline monitor, so I've still got that open here. So again, you could just search for deadline monitor on the PC or the Mac and launch that. So here it is. So I should get a green thing to show that it's an active render job at the top of my render list here. So that shows me the project, it shows me the camera, and it shows me the user. So that's my username that I'm using here. And if I kind of scroll over a little bit here, it's showing me the task progress. So at the moment it hasn't finished any frames, it's rendering, and then that 16 is the number of machines that it's currently rendering on. So down here we have the list of machines. They're all green to show they're kind of active. You can see they're all rendering. They've all been rendering now for a few seconds. So I'm basically using up the entire render farm. Fantastic at this moment in time. And so this is machine names, so this is render jobs, so there's no one else in front of me, so it's going to be rendering. Whilst my job is selected here, these are the actual frames of my render job. So these ones in white, they're queued, they're yet to be rendered yet. These ones up the top, they're obviously rendering. If I scroll over here a little bit, I'll see the progress. So on the render farm you tend to find there's a little bit of startup time. Not really that much happens, say for 30-40 seconds, that's not unusual, and then it starts actually rendering your frames out. So On the local machine, I think each of these frames was probably taking me certainly a few minutes per frame to actually render, maybe something like 4 or 5 minutes to render. So my render job on the local machine, let's say, was a 5 minute per frame. I've obviously got 24 frames, so what's that? About 120 minutes, about 2 hours it would probably take to render out that sequence on the local machine. We can see here it's been rendering now for nearly a couple of minutes, and 16 of those frames are, getting near halfway full. So obviously this is going to render this out pretty quickly compared to rendering every frame on the local machine, which is more or less the idea. So whilst this is rendering, obviously if you kind of go over here and you can kind of right click your job there, so if you decide to suspend it for some reason, you can do that. You could requeue it to just get it to re-render it again. You can also you can quit Maya now. I mean, we've kind of got this, so we can kind of just exit Maya. You could log out of the machine. There's no reason for you to necessarily, if you're happy with how the render seems to be going, to stay there. So these frames are now completely rendered. Once frames have completely rendered, all of those 16 have now rendered, so it's going pretty quick. You can then view the output. So in the default viewer, that would open up Photoshop and show you that file. Or more usefully, you can explore the output, I think, and that would take you to that folder. If this is okay, so there we go. So there's my folder. So I could just press space on the Mac and get a preview. So this seems to be rendering out kind of the way I'd expect it to be rendering out. Yep. Obviously, this is just a still image sequence here, so I could put this together as a QuickTime movie in Premiere or iMovie or whatever you prefer to stick it in. Up here I can also see I've got no errors, that's good. I can delete the job completely, so if I made a complete mistake, or I could just fail the job, so if I realised I'm rendering the wrong camera, or I'd selected V-Ray and it's an Arnold scene or whatever, you can fail the job and then delete it. If you rendered it and you really don't want to use, you've taken the files off the render machine and you've used them, you can actually delete this from this queue, so that this queue doesn't just get cluttered up with loads and loads of previous renders for some reason. But obviously make sure you've got all the files copied to your local machine before you do that. It's rendering just these last few frames here. You can also resubmit a job here, or you can modify some of the job properties, so you can change the priority and resubmit it. You can also, over here, you can change the frame range. So if you've got a long animation, you don't have to open up Maya again. If it's just the same scene, you could just say, okay, maybe this I only rendered the first 10 frames, but now I'm going to render the first 100 frames, and I could just go back. I wouldn't need to open Maya, it would just requeue that job, which is quite handy. Over here you can look at task reports. If there are errors, you can look at those and you can maybe try and figure out what kind of went wrong with that or something like that. Just got my last few frames rendering here, and then this will be completely finished. So I'm just going to explore my output here. So that's looking pretty good. So you can also see the render time for each frame over here. So you can see you can also look at how much CPU was used. So for a lot of these frames they were working at 100% CPU time for their peak CPU. I can look at my render time. So most of these were about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, something like that on the render farm per frame. And there we go. I think that's now it completed. So I should be able to kind of just sort of scrub through my completely finished render, and it's just going to go around the whole turntable, and there we go, job done. Okay, so that's basically all there is to kind of using the basics of the render farm. There's a few kind of tweaks you can do for doing tile rendering and things like that, but hopefully that's been useful. Okay, that's the end.